Before colonization, the Africa they tried to erase. When people hear the word Africa, many only picture suffering, poverty, and colonization. But that is not the beginning of our story. Long before European powers arrived, Africa was already alive with kingdoms, science, trade, leadership, wisdom, and greatness. This was not a land waiting to be discovered. This was a continent that was already building civilization. And today, we are going back to remember the Africa they tried to hide. Before colonial borders, before foreign flags, before the world tried to define us, Africa was already speaking for itself. From the highlands of Ethiopia to the gold fields of West Africa, from the trading ports of the Indian Ocean to the stone cities of the South, Africa was not empty. It was organized. It was advanced. It was powerful. Let us begin in the East. 1. Kingdoms of power. The kingdom of Aksum in today's Ethiopia and Eritrea was one of the great powers of the ancient world. It traded with Rome, Arabia, and India. It minted its own coins. It built massive stone monuments, and it became one of the earliest kingdoms to embrace Christianity. Aksum was not a small local kingdom. It was a center of influence, belief, and international trade. In the west stood the mighty Mali Empire. Under Mansa Musa, Mali became one of the richest empires in history. But his greatness was not only in wealth, it was in vision. He supported learning, strengthened cities, and helped make places like Timbuktu famous for scholarship. Africa was not just producing gold, it was producing greatness. Further along the coast, the Swahili city-states connected Africa with Asia and the Middle East. Cities like Kilwa and Mombasa were full of merchants, scholars, builders, and artists. They were proof that Africa was never isolated. Africa was connected. Africa was global. And in the south, Great Zimbabwe rose with stone walls built by African hands and African intelligence. No modern machines, no imported blueprints, just skill, vision, and determination. That is African history. 2. Wisdom, leadership, and justice. Africa was not only about kings and empires, it was also about systems of wisdom. Across many African societies, leaders were expected to serve, not just command. Elders met to resolve disputes. Communities discussed important matters together. Justice was often rooted in dialogue, responsibility, and harmony. Leadership was not simply a throne, it was a duty. A leader had to protect the people, respect tradition, and carry moral responsibility. In Ethiopia, imperial authority was often tied to sacred duty and legitimacy. That reminds us of something important. African leadership had meaning. It was not random. It was not empty. It was built on values. Before colonial systems arrived, African societies already knew how to govern, judge, organize, and preserve order. 3. Trade that connected the world. Africa's economy was alive. Gold, salt, ivory, spices, cloth, beads, and grain moved across deserts, rivers, and oceans. The trans-Saharan trade routes linked West Africa with North Africa and the wider Mediterranean world. The Red Sea and Indian Ocean routes connected East Africa with Arabia, India, and beyond. This was not a silent continent. This was a continent in motion. Markets were busy. Cities were growing. Ideas were traveling. Cultures were meeting. Africa was not waiting for the world. Africa was already part of the world. And that is something many people were never taught. 4. Knowledge, faith, and civilization. Africa was also a center of learning. In places like Timbuktu, scholars studied astronomy, medicine, law, theology, and philosophy. Books were preserved. Knowledge was protected. Wisdom was passed from generation to generation. In Ethiopia, ancient manuscripts were written in Ge'ez. In churches, libraries, and learning centers, faith and knowledge lived side by side. And in places like Lalibela, our ancestors carved holy structures directly from stone, showing creativity that the world still admires today. This was not just survival. This was civilization. This was art. This was belief. This was intelligence. Africa did not need to be civilized by outsiders. Africa already had civilization, dreams. The disruption. Then came the age of conquest. By the late 19th century, European powers met in Berlin and divided Africa without asking Africans. They drew lines on maps, they ignored history, they broke communities apart. They called it order, but it was not order, it was domination. It was not progress, it was disruption. It did not create African greatness, it interrupted African greatness. And that is the truth many histories still try to soften. Colonization did not begin Africa, it interrupted Africa. The lesson for us today. But here is the most important part. Africa is not only history, Africa is still alive. We are the children of builders, the descendants of scholars, the heirs of warriors, architects, farmers, thinkers, and leaders. We come from Aksum, we come from Mali, we come from Great Zimbabwe, we come from the Swahili coast, we come from the spirit of Adwa, and our generation must not live with a weak mind. We must not inherit shame. We must inherit truth. We must study our history. We must build our nations. We must protect our dignity. We must lead with wisdom. Because when a people forget their past, they become easy to control. But when a people remember their greatness, they rise. Africa did not begin with colonization. Africa began with greatness, with kingdoms, with wisdom, with trade, with faith, with knowledge, with power. And that greatness still lives in us.